Have you ever wondered what truly threatens a perfect crime? The meticulous plan, the flawless execution, or something far more fragile and unpredictable? When two or more people conspire together, the element of trust becomes the invisible thread holding everything in place. Yet, isn't it ironic how that same trust can unravel a carefully woven web faster than any piece of forensic evidence or surveillance footage ever could? Imagine a crime so expertly planned that it leaves no trace behind. No witnesses to testify, no fingerprints, no digital footprints, nothing that might raise even the faintest suspicion. Every detail accounted for, every risk minimized. The operation goes off without a hitch, like clockwork. From the outside, it seems impossible to crack. No alarms sounded, no alarms triggered, nothing to suggest anything amiss. The perpetrators walk away, confident that their secret is safe, their faces hidden beneath layers of anonymity and careful deception. But the story doesn't end there. It rarely does. What destroyed this perfect crime wasn't a high-tech breakthrough, a sudden tip-off, or an unexpected betrayal. It wasn't an arrest during the act or a hidden camera catching a slip. It happened afterward, in the quiet aftermath when the adrenaline fades and the participants start to feel the weight of what they've done. It wasn't a confession, not even a hint of remorse. Instead, it was a single sentence, a few words spoken in a moment that seemed insignificant, almost casual. Words that introduced information no one should have had, words that cracked the facade of silence. The partners in crime had trusted each other implicitly. They had rehearsed, planned, and synchronized every move with precision. Their loyalty seemed unbreakable, their bond forged in secrecy and shared risk. But human nature is complicated. Conversations happen, memories falter, and sometimes the truth slips out in the most unexpected way. That one sentence quietly shattered the illusion of loyalty. It gave investigators a new angle to pursue, a thread to pull that unraveled the entire story. What's fascinating here is that the crime itself remained flawless. There was no physical evidence to speak of, no glaring mistakes in the execution. The plan was impeccable, yet it was a single moment of human error, a breach in silence that began the downfall. Suddenly, what once seemed invincible started to crumble, not because of technology or brute force, but because of the unpredictable nature of people. This case forces us to reconsider the fragile balance behind every crime. It's not just the planning or the tools used that determine success or failure. Often, it's the silence afterward, the shared secret that must never be broken. That is the most vulnerable element. When that silence fractures, everything else falls apart. And in this story, that fracture came not from guilt or confession, but from a trusted partner's careless words, spoken just once, at the wrong time. The tension between what's planned and what's left unsaid often defines the fate of a crime far more than the act itself. In this story, it wasn't the meticulous details of the scheme that led to the unraveling, but rather the quiet moments that followed, the deliberate silence both partners tried to maintain. But how difficult is that silence to hold? Is it truly harder to keep than the careful plotting of the crime? And when two people share such a dangerous secret, could the trust between them become the most volatile factor of all? Think about it. When a crime is committed together, it's not just the risk of discovery that haunts the conspirators. It's the fragile dynamic of their relationship, the invisible tension of what remains unspoken. One slip of the tongue, one careless comment, can shatter that fragile alliance and send everything crashing down. Does trust, in these cases, become a double-edged sword, necessary to carry out the plan, yet potentially the most dangerous element in the aftermath? As you follow this story, consider where the true danger lies. Is it in the act itself, or in the silence that follows? In the end, it's not just a matter of who planned it better, but who managed to keep the secret intact. Share your thoughts below. Do you believe silence is the hardest part to maintain after a crime? And is trust between partners the most precarious variable in any joint criminal act? Your reflections might reveal more about the hidden fractures of these perfect crimes gone wrong than any evidence ever could. The partnership between the two individuals didn't arise from a sudden impulse, but from a gradual recognition of mutual advantage, slowly solidified through shared experiences and a growing sense of reliability. Their initial connection was almost incidental, a chance meeting that revealed complementary needs and skills. One was meticulous, cautious, with a knack for observation and detail. The other was bold, quick-witted, and possessed a natural charisma that could disarm suspicion. This balance created an unspoken synergy, where each saw in the other not just a partner but a necessary counterpart without whom the plan would falter. Trust, in their case, didn't bloom overnight. It was built in the silence between words, in the way they communicated without speaking, in the small tests they set for each other. When one took a risk and the other silently covered the fallout, trust deepened. It was less a leap of faith and more a steady accumulation of proof that neither would betray the other. This trust was not blind but calculated. Both understood the stakes, and the price of betrayal was far too high to entertain. They knew that the success of their endeavor hinged not on technology or elaborate tools, but on their ability to maintain an unbreakable code of silence. Their relationship was the linchpin of the entire operation, and it was precisely because they trusted each other that the crime became possible. Each depended on the other to stay disciplined, to resist impulsive confessions or lapses in judgment that could unravel everything. Roles were divided with care. One was the planner and strategist, the other the executor and liaison. The planner's strength lay in anticipating every possible variable, but without the executor's adaptability and presence of mind, those plans would have remained theoretical. Meanwhile, the executor relied on the planner's foresight and calm to navigate the unpredictable, ensuring that their actions stayed within the narrow margins of safety they had carved out. Their dependence on one another extended beyond the logistical. It was psychological. They reinforced each other's resolve, a mutual affirmation that this secret was their shared burden and their shared protection. Discipline was more than following a plan. It was about self-control, about managing fear and temptation, about sustaining the fragile balance between confidence and caution. Each knew that a single word spoken in haste or a moment of weakness could ignite a domino effect leading to their downfall. What stands out most is how the entire success rested on human behavior rather than mechanical precision. The tools they employed, the timing they orchestrated, even the environment they exploited, were secondary to their ability to control impulses, to communicate silently, and to trust without reservation. It was a psychological tightrope, where one misstep could send shockwaves through the entire operation. The most sophisticated gadgets or the most foolproof plans would have crumbled without this foundation of mutual trust and unyielding discipline. Yet, it was this very foundation that also exposed their greatest vulnerability. Trust, while essential, opened a door to potential betrayal, whether intentional or accidental. In the quiet moments after the act, when adrenaline faded and reality set in, doubts could creep in, guilt could gnaw at conscience, and the pressure to break silence could become unbearable. Their reliance on each other meant that if one faltered, both would fall. The partnership was a double-edged sword. Its strength and unity was matched by the fragility of that unity itself. Ultimately, the crime's perfection was less about the plan's brilliance and more about the human element, the intricate dance of trust and silence between two people bound by a secret. It was a delicate equilibrium, maintained not by force but by an unspoken agreement, a pact forged in shadows, where their fates were entwined by the precarious balance of confidence and vulnerability. This dynamic was the heart of their endeavor and the key to both their success and their potential undoing. Every element of the crime unfolded with an almost mechanical precision, as if rehearsed countless times behind closed doors yet executed flawlessly in the real world. The hours leading up to the event had been spent meticulously coordinating every detail, from the timing of their movements to the silent communication signals that would keep them in sync without drawing attention. Each participant had a clearly defined role, and none deviated from it. The plan was less about improvisation and more about strict adherence to a script that had been tested and refined until any margin for error was eliminated. When the moment arrived, the operation moved like clockwork. The entry point was chosen for its obscurity and accessibility, a back entrance shielded by shadows and out of the gaze of surveillance cameras. The team arrived in staggered intervals, blending seamlessly with the sparse foot traffic, their attire carefully selected to avoid suspicion. No one lingered unnecessarily. No one spoke louder than a whisper. The atmosphere was charged but controlled, every breath measured, every step deliberate. Inside, the layout of the location was already etched into their minds, courtesy of prior reconnaissance and detailed blueprints. The security system had been expertly bypassed. No alarms sounded. No unexpected alerts disrupted the calm. The electronic safeguards, known to be state-of-the-art, had been neutralized by a combination of hacking skills and physical manipulation, rendering them dormant for the critical window of time. Surveillance feeds were looped seamlessly, presenting a static image that masked their intrusion perfectly. Each piece of equipment used was tested extensively before the night, ensuring reliability under pressure. The tools glided through locks with mechanical ease, the doors yielding silently without a creak or groan. The team's movements were choreographed, each member covering a specific sector, eyes sharp for any sign of interference. When one member completed their task, a subtle hand gesture signaled the next phase, and the process continued without hesitation. Even the environment cooperated. The weather was clear, the night unusually quiet, and the streets near the scene deserted. No unexpected pedestrians or vehicles crossed their path to risk exposure. The absence of any witnesses was a silent testament to the thoroughness of their planning, which included scouting the area for patterns of activity and ensuring the timing minimized the chance of accidental encounters. Inside, the loot was secured with the same care. Valuable items were carefully handled, packed into cases designed to muffle sound and prevent damage. Every item was accounted for in a prearranged manifest, ensuring efficiency and eliminating any need for unnecessary delays. As the final piece was stowed away, a collective sense of calm satisfaction settled over the group. The operation had progressed exactly as envisioned, each stage completed without deviation or incident. The exit was as smooth as the entry. Retracing their steps, the team moved with quiet confidence, slipping back through the back corridors and out into the night. Vehicles awaited at predetermined locations, engines off until the last moment, enabling swift and silent departures. Radio silence was maintained, with only hand signals confirming each checkpoint cleared. The rendezvous points were remote and secure, chosen to avoid routine patrols and minimize the risk of interception. As the distance between them and the crime scene grew, so did their sense of relief. The tension that had held them taut throughout the operation began to dissolve into a quiet pride. At that moment, they believed the danger was behind them. The risk had been contained entirely within the boundaries of the plan, and nothing had strayed beyond their control. The perfect execution fostered a shared confidence, a belief that the invisible web of careful preparation had shielded them from harm. For now, their secret remained intact, held close by the unspoken pact that had bound them from the start. The successful outcome reinforced the fragile trust that had been their anchor, and in that fleeting moment, the criminals allowed themselves to believe they had outsmarted fate itself. Days slid into weeks, and with each passing moment, the sharp edges of fear dulled under the weight of routine. Life, once held in a tense grip, began to breathe again, slow and steady. The group found themselves slipping back into patterns that felt familiar and safe, as though the crime had been a distant storm that had passed without leaving a trace. Mornings were no longer greeted with silent, watchful eyes scanning for danger. Instead, coffee cups clinked, casual conversations filled the air, and laughter, tentative but genuine, started to break through the surface. The initial necessity for tight-lipped silence gave way to a subtle loosening of tongues. At first, conversations were still measured, a careful dance around sensitive topics, but gradually the edges softened. The weight of the secret no longer pressed as heavily on their words. They began to speak more freely, sharing jokes and memories that had nothing to do with the crime. Confidence grew not in grand gestures but in the small, everyday moments. A shared glance that held no suspicion, a relaxed posture in a room full of people, a smile that wasn't forced. With comfort came complacency. The vigilance that had once defined every movement and glance ebbed quietly, almost imperceptibly. The constant awareness of being watched or overheard, which had created an invisible barrier around their lives, thinned into something more fragile and porous. They stopped double-checking locked doors or scanning crowds with the same intensity. The relentless checklist of precautions, once etched into their minds, faded like footprints in the sand. This was the paradox of success. Where silence had been the hardest to maintain before the crime, it became even more elusive after. The very triumph that should have fortified their control instead began to chip away at it. Their meetings, once conducted with hushed urgency and coded language, became more casual. Plans were discussed openly, though still under a veil of politeness, and the sense of shared danger that had bound them as tightly as chains loosened into a sense of camaraderie. Yet it was in this shift that the first cracks appeared. The more they trusted the silence, the more they underestimated the subtle perils of speaking freely. In their growing ease, they forgot that control is a fragile construct, especially after victory. The quiet confidence that filled the spaces between their words was a soft invitation to forget the shadows that still lingered. This slow slide from caution to comfort was not marked by a single moment but by countless small ones. An offhand comment, a glance held too long, a careless gesture. Each instance was a thread pulling at the carefully woven fabric of their concealment. The invisible web that had once protected them began to unravel quietly, unnoticed until the damage was done. It was here, in these unguarded moments, that control began to weaken, not with a crash, but with a whisper. As the days unfolded, the group found themselves caught in the subtle trap of normalcy. They wanted to believe that the worst was behind them, that the perfect crime had sealed their fate as untouchable. But in embracing the comfort of routine, they unknowingly invited risk back into their lives. The silence that had once been their shield now demanded a new kind of discipline, one that was harder to maintain because it required constant vigilance in the face of growing ease. In this quiet unraveling, they lived on the edge of exposure without realizing it. The crime that had once defined their every thought and action became a distant memory, overshadowed by the desire to reclaim normal life. Yet, the very success that gave them freedom also sowed the seeds of their vulnerability. The invisible web that had held them together began to fray, thread by thread, as silence slipped through their fingers like sand, harder to hold after triumph than before. The moment the partner finally spoke came unexpectedly, nestled within the kind of ordinary afternoon that might have seemed unremarkable to any outside observer. They were seated across from each other at the small kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of neighbors drifting through the cracked window creating an atmosphere of calm. The sunlight filtered gently through the curtains, casting patterns on the worn wood surface where a few scattered papers and a forgotten coffee cup lay. It was the kind of setting where conversations typically drifted between mundane topics. Plans for the weekend, the latest neighborhood gossip, or the weather. Nothing that would hint at the storm gathering beneath the surface. What made this moment feel safe and informal was precisely its ordinariness. There was no tension in the air, no hint of accusation or distrust. They had grown so accustomed to the delicate dance of silence that had governed their interactions for months that speaking felt almost like breaking a natural rhythm. The partner's voice, when it finally emerged, was low and unassuming, as if testing the waters rather than declaring something definitive. It was a hesitant admission, rather than a confession, soothed by the familiarity of the setting. The gravity of what was said was masked by the casual tone, the kind of words that could be easily brushed aside or forgotten amid the endless chatter of daily life. No one realized the damage being done in real time because the cracks were so subtle. The partner's words were not a shout but a whisper, a seed planted in the fertile ground of complacency. It was as if the act of breaking silence itself was a betrayal, not for what was spoken, but for the fact that it disrupted the fragile equilibrium they had painstakingly maintained. In that moment, the invisible web began to unravel, but the threads were too fine, too interwoven with trust and shared history, for anyone to notice immediately. They looked at each other across the table, saw the familiar faces they had known for years, and convinced themselves that nothing had changed. Yet, beneath the surface, the balance had shifted irrevocably. The partner's words echoed in the silence that followed, filling the spaces between their thoughts with doubt and unease. It was the beginning of a slow erosion, the kind that didn't happen overnight but grew steadily, like a crack in a dam or a rust that spreads unnoticed until the structure weakens. They continued their routines, smiled, and made plans, pretending that the silence could be restored, that the past could be sealed away once again. But trust, once fractured, is not easily repaired. At this point, it's worth pausing to ask, do you believe silence is harder to maintain than action? And is trust truly the most fragile element in any crime, the one that, once broken, causes everything else to collapse? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective might shed light on the delicate balance between what is said and what is left unsaid. The partner's words, though seemingly insignificant at the time, became a catalyst for change. They forced a reckoning with the reality they had tried so hard to avoid. The informal, harmless moment that had seemed so safe was, in fact, the first crack in the facade of their carefully constructed freedom. Like a whispered confession carried on a gentle breeze, it unsettled the foundation beneath them, exposing vulnerabilities that had been hidden by silence and trust. In the quiet aftermath, both felt the weight of that moment differently. One saw it as an opening, a chance to confront long-buried truths. The other, as a threat, a disruption that could unravel everything they had built together. The ease of the setting, the kitchen table bathed in afternoon light, belied the undercurrent of tension that now pulsed beneath their interactions. What was once a shared secret had become a chasm, stretching wider with every unspoken word. They were caught in the paradox of their own success. The very triumph that had freed them from the immediate dangers of their past had also made silence more precarious. In the absence of external pressure, internal doubts grew louder, and the delicate web of trust that had held them together began to fray. No longer could they rely on inaction or mutual avoidance to keep the peace. The partner's voice, released in that quiet moment, was a turning point, a subtle but irreversible step toward the unraveling of everything they had tried so hard to preserve. The sentence was dangerous not because it revealed a confession, but because it quietly disrupted the carefully constructed narrative everyone had been forced to accept. It was almost innocuous in its delivery, a simple phrase slipped into conversation without fanfare. Yet the implications reverberated beneath the surface, unsettling the foundation of the official story in a way that was as subtle as it was profound. It didn't shout contradictions. It whispered them, planting a seed of doubt that could grow into something irreparable. What made this sentence so threatening was its introduction of information that logically could not exist if the official version were accurate. The story they had all been told, repeatedly, insistently, relied on a tightly controlled sequence of events, each element carefully aligned to support the next. This sentence, however, inserted a detail that didn't fit. It wasn't an outright denial or an explosive revelation. It was an offhand remark that implied knowledge of something that had been deliberately erased or ignored. It suggested the presence of factors, people, or actions that the narrative claimed weren't there. This quiet contradiction was the crack in the dam, the first sign that the story's integrity was compromised. The danger was in its subtlety. Had the words been more dramatic or explicit, they might have been dismissed as outbursts or mistakes, easy to explain away or silence. But because they were understated, delivered almost casually, they carried a weight that was harder to dismiss. No one could accuse the speaker of exaggeration or emotional outburst. The statement was too measured, too precise. This made it difficult for those invested in preserving the official account to respond without sounding defensive or evasive. The sentence's quiet confidence forced a reckoning. If this piece of information was true, then other parts of the story had to be questioned. Moreover, the sentence worked on multiple levels. On the surface, it seemed like a simple observation, something that could be overlooked by anyone not paying close attention. Yet, for those who knew the details, it exposed inconsistencies that had been carefully concealed. It suggested that the timeline was off, that certain actions had been taken earlier or later than claimed, or that individuals had been present where they should not have been. Each of these implications chipped away at the narrative's coherence. The official story, previously seen as unassailable, suddenly appeared fragile and incomplete. This subtle disruption forced the characters, and by extension the audience, to reevaluate what they believed. The power of the sentence lay not in what it said outright, but in what it implied and what it left unsaid. It demanded that listeners reconsider the reliability of the sources and question the motives behind the narrative's construction. It introduced the possibility that the version of events they had accepted was, at best, a partial truth and, at worst, a deliberate fabrication. In the context of their fractured trust and growing unease, the sentence became a catalyst. It was a quiet but irreversible step toward the unraveling of the carefully maintained facade. No longer could silence or avoidance contain the mounting tension. The sentence planted doubt in a way that was both subtle and powerful, ensuring that the delicate web of deception could no longer hold. It was a turning point, not because it screamed its meaning, but because it whispered it with deadly precision. The words slipped out in the middle of an otherwise mundane exchange, woven seamlessly into the fabric of casual conversation. No one flinched, no one paused to parse what had just been said. In a room full of people accustomed to guarded speech and double meanings, it was easy for such a line to drift by unnoticed, absorbed into the background noise of everyday chatter. It carried no immediate threat, no glaring alarm bells, just a peculiar phrase that might have raised an eyebrow under different circumstances. But here, amid the hum of small talk, it was indistinct, almost forgettable. Investigators, trained to identify clear breaches, confessions, contradictions, overt admissions, heard the sentence but failed to grasp its weight. To them, it was merely off. A subtle oddity in tone or choice of words that didn't quite fit the flow but didn't scream guilt either. Their ears, tuned for the dramatic, missed the quiet crack forming in the facade. The phrase didn't demand scrutiny. It invited dismissal. It was the difference between a shout and a whisper. The danger lay not in the immediate reaction it provoked, but in the slow erosion of certainty it would cause over time. The setting itself contributed to this initial oversight. People spoke over one another, conversations overlapping like layers of sound, and the sentence was absorbed into the collective background. It was a fragment, a ghost of an idea that didn't yet have the power to disrupt the narrative everyone was desperate to maintain. The words became one more piece of noise, lost in the clutter of daily life. No one had the patience or the reason to single it out, and so it settled into the memory of those present as a faint, unexplained unease rather than a piece of concrete evidence. This was the subtlety of the moment's danger. It did not shout but insinuated. It planted a seed of doubt that grew quietly, unnoticed at first. Over hours, then days, the phrase began to replay in the minds of those who heard it, not as a direct accusation but as an echo of something unresolved. The investigators found themselves revisiting conversations, trying to reconcile that odd tone with known facts. It was memory, not immediate reaction, that turned the phrase from a casual utterance into a critical thread unraveling the carefully woven deception. In hindsight, the sentence was a quiet fissure in a brittle wall, an unnoticed crack that would eventually widen. It was the kind of detail that perfect crimes rely on being overlooked, the very thing that distinguishes a flawless scheme from one that crumbles in time. No one reacted because no one understood its significance in the moment. The danger was not in the spoken word itself, but in the way it lodged itself in the minds of those who heard it, slowly reshaping their understanding and casting shadows on previously accepted truths. The investigators' failure to respond immediately was not negligence but a reflection of human nature. We often miss the importance of a whisper amid the din, especially when we expect to find only loud truths. The sentence was like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, prompting a vague sense of unease rather than a call to action. Only through the slow work of memory, reflection, and growing suspicion did it become clear that this was not a casual comment but a subtle admission, a coded message wrapped in ordinary speech. Thus, the danger was delayed but no less real. The unraveling did not come from confrontation but from the quiet persistence of doubt seeded by a single, seemingly insignificant line. It was the slow-burning fuse of memory that ultimately ignited the blaze, proving that in the realm of deception, the most perilous moments are often the ones that go unnoticed at first glance. The sentence lingered in the back of Detective Harris's mind, an odd fragment that didn't quite fit the narrative they had painstakingly pieced together. At the time of the initial investigation, it had seemed almost trivial, an offhand remark from a witness, buried beneath a mountain of more pressing evidence. Yet, as days turned into weeks, that single line resurfaced repeatedly, like a ghost haunting the edges of the case. It was only when Harris revisited the statement with fresh eyes and new information that its true significance became impossible to ignore. The sentence, spoken by a neighbor who had claimed to hear a muffled argument late at night, contained a detail that seemed inconsistent with the timeline they had established. Initially dismissed because it contradicted a well-rehearsed alibi, the remark was revisited when a forensic analyst uncovered traces of an unusual substance at the scene, one that didn't match any known materials related to the victim or the accused. This new evidence breathed life into the old sentence, prompting Harris and his team to question the reliability of the alibi that had seemed so airtight. As the sentence was examined more closely, it raised a cascade of questions. Why had the neighbor's observation been overlooked? Could the argument have been a sign of a deeper conflict? What if the alibi, which had initially seemed solid, was built on shaky ground or outright deception? These questions began to erode the foundation of certainty that the investigators had taken for granted. They pressured witnesses to clarify their statements, re-interviewed key individuals, and scrutinized the timeline with renewed skepticism. The pressure mounted slowly, like a tightening noose. The lead suspect, once confident in their story, began to falter under the persistent probing. Small inconsistencies emerged, contradictions that had been glossed over in the rush to close the case. The detective team noticed subtle shifts in behavior, hesitations, vague answers, moments of defensiveness, that hinted at something deeper beneath the surface. It became clear that the crime had not collapsed instantaneously. Rather, it unraveled piece by piece, under the relentless weight of inquiry sparked by that one overlooked sentence. That sentence, initially a whisper in the background, had become a catalyst. It forced the investigators to confront uncomfortable possibilities, to question their assumptions, and to dig deeper into the tangled web of relationships and motives surrounding the case. The unraveling wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was methodical and deliberate, a slow-burning process that exposed the cracks in the facade of innocence. In the end, the sentence revealed a hidden truth, one that implicated someone previously thought to be uninvolved. It exposed a carefully constructed deception, a plan that had seemed foolproof until the quiet persistence of doubt took hold. The crime, once considered solved, was now a complex puzzle demanding answers. The unraveling was not a sudden event but a gradual revelation, a testament to the power of careful observation and the dangers of overlooking even the smallest detail. The story of the case became a reminder that in the pursuit of justice, no piece of evidence is too insignificant to reconsider. The slow, deliberate questioning that followed the resurfacing of that sentence transformed the investigation from a closed chapter into an ongoing search for truth. It was a lesson in patience, vigilance, and the relentless nature of doubt. A reminder that in perfect crimes gone wrong, the smallest misstep can set off a chain reaction that topples the entire carefully built narrative. The room, once filled with the low hum of calculated confidence, grew heavy with an oppressive silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that signaled calm or control. Instead, it settled like a suffocating fog, thick and unyielding. Each person present felt it pressing inward, shrinking the space between them until their shared breaths were audible, uneven, betraying the steady facades they tried so hard to maintain. That moment marked the first crack in their collective armor, the instant when the gravity of their situation became undeniable. The damage was no longer something to be managed or hidden, it was irreversible. It began with a glance, subtle and fleeting, exchanged between two of the conspirators. Neither spoke, but the unspoken message was clear. Something had slipped through the cracks, something fundamental. The meticulous plan they had woven with such care was unraveling before their eyes, and no amount of denial could patch the widening tear. The phrase that had resurfaced, the sentence that had been brushed aside like a forgotten detail, now echoed relentlessly in their minds. It was a seed of doubt, planted long ago, that had finally sprouted into a weed too wild to contain. In that charged silence, the trust that had once cemented their partnership began to erode. Each second stretched longer, and with it, suspicion crept in like a shadow at dusk. The unity forged by shared purpose dissolved into a fragile web of uncertainty. Questions that had been left unasked now clamored for attention. Who had made the mistake? Who had overlooked the detail? Was the betrayal accidental or was it deliberate? The answers were nowhere to be found, and the absence of clarity was itself a form of punishment. What had been a synchronized dance of precision now felt like a chaotic scramble. Their minds raced, trying to piece together the implications of what had been uncovered. They replayed every conversation, every action, every decision, searching for the moment the plan had faltered. But the truth was stark and unsettling. It had slipped through their fingers, beyond recall or repair. The perfect crime was no longer perfect. It was a fragile illusion shattered by the smallest grain of sand. Fear began to take root in the silence. It wasn't the immediate panic of discovery or confrontation that would come later, but a slow-burning dread that consumed from within. It was the fear of exposure, yes, but more so the fear of each other. When trust dissolves, the greatest threat is no longer outside forces but the partners who once stood shoulder to shoulder. Every glance was now weighed with suspicion, every word measured for hidden meaning. The alliance that had made their crime possible was turning inward, becoming its own undoing. They could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle but unmistakable tension that hinted at fractures too deep to mend. The shared history, the complicity, the secrets whispered in shadows, all of it now a liability. The silence that had once been a comfortable space for mutual understanding was now a breeding ground for doubt, mistrust, and fear. It was a silence that screamed louder than any accusation, louder than any confession. In that moment, the criminals understood that they had crossed a point of no return. The damage was done, and its consequences would ripple outward, disrupting not just their plans but their very relationships. The partnership that had once been their greatest strength was now their most vulnerable weakness, a weakness that could be exploited either by external forces or by one another. No words were spoken to acknowledge this new reality. None were needed. The realization hung in the air, an invisible barrier that separated them despite their physical proximity. Each felt the weight of isolation, even in a crowded room. The careful balance of power was tipping, and with it, the fragile trust that had been their foundation crumbled irrevocably. The perfect crime had gone wrong, and in that irreversible moment, silence transformed into an unspoken fear. The criminals were no longer united by purpose but divided by doubt, caught in a web of their own making where every ally could become an adversary, and every secret could be the key to their downfall. In the intricate web of deception and calculated moves that defined their plan, the most unpredictable factor wasn't the law enforcement on their trail, nor the meticulous details of the crime itself. It was human error, the subtle, uncontrollable breach that no amount of preparation can fully guard against. When the perfect crime unravels, it's rarely due to a flaw in the scheme but rather because someone, somewhere, spoke too much, revealed too little, or simply lost control over their own words. The tension that once bound the group together began to fracture not because their plan was flawed, but because the fragile trust they shared was compromised by careless speech. In moments of fear, guilt, or desperation, even the most disciplined individuals may let slip a crucial piece of information. A name, a location, a motive that sends shockwaves through the entire operation. This is the most dangerous variable in any crime, human communication. Unchecked, it becomes a silent assassin, dismantling alliances and exposing secrets that had been buried beneath layers of silence. No plan, no matter how brilliantly executed, can survive when the people involved start talking, especially when words are spoken impulsively or under duress. It's not the noise of the outside world that breaks the crime. It's the internal discord, the whispered doubts, the accidental confessions that corrode the foundation. Perfection in planning is meaningless if the participants cannot maintain a disciplined silence. This core lesson resonates beyond the confines of any single case. Crimes don't fail because of the initial execution. They fail when the participants betray their own code of silence, consciously or unconsciously. A single slip of the tongue can unravel months of careful preparation, turning allies into suspects and secrets into evidence. The real threat lies not in the complexity of the crime, but in the unpredictability of human nature. If there's one takeaway from this story and countless others like it, it's this: control your words as fiercely as you control your actions, because once spoken, there's no taking them back. Human error in speech is the weakest link in any criminal endeavor, and it's the element that law enforcement counts on to crack even the most perfect cases. If you found this exploration of human error in crime compelling, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think is the most common human mistake that causes crimes to fall apart? Your perspective could shed light on this hidden vulnerability. And don't miss our next video, where we'll dive into another gripping case, revealing how one small detail shattered silence and changed everything. Stay tuned.